So today we're going to talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we're going to combine that with two book reviews. I have two books that were written in Vietnam, and small amounts of them were translated into English and printed in Vietnam for export. This first one is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This one was printed in the 2000s. And the other one is Legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was published by the National Politics Publishing House, and we'll actually look at where these were made so that you can obtain a copy if possible. Now, this book was printed in small numbers in English. I think this was only made in a number of 2,000 copies in English. I have no idea how many Vietnamese language copies were made. This book was printed for the celebration and commemoration of the end of the war in 1995. So in 1995, that was the 20-year anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam. Now, the interesting thing is these books are from the Vietnamese perspective. So they were written by the winner of the war. And what I find really interesting is there's two questions that come to mind that the U.S. side and the Vietnamese side never answered. So these questions involve how many people were killed in the construction and operation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail by U.S. forces. And the other question is, what percentage of the supplies actually made it down the trail into South Vietnam? And when you talk about supplies, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was designed to move supplies and personnel, so it was actually a whole series of trails and roads. Some were footpaths, some were for Ho Chi Minh bicycles, some were for horses and elephants, others were for vehicles, tanks, etc. So almost all of these were one-lane roads, as you can see from this photo. So the road flowed in one direction for a certain period of time, and then in the opposite direction for another period of time. So a lot of communication was necessary for that. So what we'll do is review these books, look at the photographs, some of the text, and we'll kind of get to looking at it from a different perspective. And you're going to see a lot of photographs of things you haven't seen from the Ho Chi Minh Trail before. So we'll get started. Now we'll start with this small book first. It has a lot of quality photographs in it. And the first one you'll notice here is on the cover, and there's actually a more complete version of this photograph further in the book and also in the other book. But what I want you to notice is on this truck here, there is a camouflage rack that is built on top of this truck to hold foliage. And this one is partially worn down, but you can see how the rack goes out past the front of the engine here. And that's one of the way they concealed vehicles. Now, this is a complete photograph we were talking about. There's a lot to be gleaned from this. And what they're showing here is a combination of defoliation and saturation bombing, because you can see the foliage and most of the trees are blown away here. So this was a combination of Agent Orange. There was also another defoliant called Agent White that was used in Vietnam, along with saturation bombing. And what you'll notice here is you have a road that's working its way up a hillside, and you can see how it zigzags and use switchbacks to go up. That's a common construction term and method. So when we look close here, you can see on these two trucks the cover that goes over the top. This was made from bamboo wood frame, and it was used to contain foliage. And that's how they camouflaged the trucks. So what's interesting from this view is the fact that the Ho Chi Minh Trail truck roads are 18.5 feet across, and they're one way. So keep that in mind as we look through these photographs and books. This is your publishing information. The author is at the top. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is the title. And I believe the pronunciation is Gioi Publishers, 2008, and it gives you the location in Vietnam it was published. Now what you have to remember is we're looking at photographs that were mostly propaganda and government-oriented photographs from the Vietnamese side. And you'll see here that this is a construction battalion, and in these photos you're going to see a tremendous amount of women and younger people. And here we have actually military engineers building an underwater bridge or a ford across a river, and it was very common to have submerged rock bridges. So basically you're building an underwater causeway across the river, and these were hard to see from the air. So what they would look for from the air is the breaks coming up out of the water, so the entrance and exit from the river. And they would look for wet areas on these embankments from truck traffic. They would also look for all the dust and debris that was kicked up on the foliage. So that's how U.S. aircraft would find these crossings. Now on the next page we have a lot of these bridges, and these were for the foot mobile, usually infantry and labor personnel, to use. These were some of the trails that ran adjacent to truck paths. And you can see here, this is another form of a ladder bridge to get up a hill embankment. So you can see here requirements for foot mobile traffic and porters carrying backpacks and cargo is much less severe. So in SHTF, this would be a good way to move supplies on foot. That way you're not doing as much clearing. So you can think of this as a pioneer road that they left in action after building the truck paths. So this is a real good photograph of a Ho Chi Minh bicycle. This one is carrying grain in burlap bags. You can see the wooden handle attached to the front steering bar. And there's a push stick that's mounted on the seat that his other hand is on. Then down here we have a truck convoy that's crossing one of the underwater stone bridges. So this is an underwater bridge at a fording site. Now this is one of the few, I think, realistic views of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because these soldiers are using PPS 43 submachine guns. When you look at the propaganda photographs, a lot of times the North Vietnamese army would only show their people, and they would show them well equipped with AK-47s rather than SKS, PPSHs, and PPS submachine guns or enemy weapons. Now, this is them applying camouflage to the trucks, and you can see the bamboo frames on here and how they are putting covers and foliage on here to hide these trucks. Now, this photograph is one that's seen a lot in Vietnamese literature. These trucks are the four-wheel drive, two-axle supply trucks. They were later replaced by ZIL type Chinese and Russian produced six-wheel drive, three-axle trucks. But for the entire war, they ran simultaneous. So when you're looking at these, this was a standard produced Russian and Chinese truck. And you can see how long this convoy is. So one of the things that's made clear in these books is the North Vietnamese army really invaded South Vietnam. and fought most of the war, where the Vietcong were the local support regulars. And several of the tribes in Laos and Cambodia fought on behalf of North Vietnam to help secure and build the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So most of what was said that was called lies in the media in the U.S. was actually factual. Now, I think you should obtain a copy of this book and read it, because this book talks a lot about the experiences of different individuals on the Vietnamese communist side when they built, fought, and defended the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And there's a lot of talk about the living conditions they endured, the type of work they had to do. And it gives you a lot of information on walking down the trail as a combatant. So if you left North Vietnam, how old you were, what kind of schooling you had, how long the journey took, and the many destinations of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Because the Ho Chi Minh Trail just didn't end at one spot. It actually branched out and fed supplies to the entire country. And one thing I believe this book talks about is how a lot of the traffic that was going down in supplies and people was going by sea until it was interdicted by U.S. forces. And that forced more and more of the supply and people from North Vietnam to go down the Ho Chi Minh Trail rather than down through the sea on the other coast. Now, this is the second book we're going to review, and I really like this book. It has some really high-quality photographs. And these photographs, the vast majority of them were taken by the author here. His name is Trong Thanh, I believe. So if anybody knows the actual pronunciation, let us know in the comments. This book was published by the National Politics Publishing House, so it was published by the actual propaganda arm in official government. And of course, you're going to have a picture of Ho Chi Minh because that's who the trail was named after. Now, what most people in America and the rest of the world don't know is that the trail was not originally named the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was named that in honor of Ho Chi Minh, who persecuted the war and came up with the tactics and strategy that they used to win. An interesting fact about Ho Chi Minh: he was wounded in World War II, and an OSS detachment actually healed him and helped him recover. So in a way, we put ourselves on the road to war with the Vietnamese because he was an anti-Japanese combatant, and we assisted both the communists and the nationalist sides in Vietnam during World War II. So in some ways, people have told me we created our own enemy. Now, this is one of the graveyards that was established. And at the beginning of this book, he dedicates the book to the people that built the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they were saying there was around 19,387 soldiers that died and 32,047 that were wounded. Now, I believe he spent most of his time at what's called Station 42, which was one of the transport stations on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I think these numbers way underestimate the amount of people killed during the war on this trail. And the reason I say that is we know the U.S. Air Force destroyed over 54,000 trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And a lot of the people were not considered soldiers that worked on there. You had laborers, you had assistance groups, and what they would call civil groups and political groups that provided a lot of the labor and assistance. In some of these groups, in some of these military units, especially Vietcong units, half of the units were women. So when we think about this, I would say these numbers are drastically low, because we also had a lot of natives and tribal populations in the area that assisted the NVA and Vietcong in building, maintaining, and operating this highway in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So on these 2 pages, we have a column of NVA regulars moving down the trail, crossing a river. This is a footpath. And then we have a female porter / combatant that's coming down the footpath portion of the trail. Now, political aspects of the war were always stressed in the NVA and Vietcong, and a lot of the auxiliaries were women. And what we have here is we have an entertainment organization that's providing morale and reinforcement of politics to the troops. And as I said here, most of the NVA are going to be shown with the AK-47. This one's a Chinese issue one, you can tell by the spike bayonet. And what you're going to find is they show the best aspects of the soldiers. Now, what I like about this book is it shows a lot of the day-to-day activity that went on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And although they are staged photographs in a lot of instances, it gives you a lot of information. And one thing I like here is we have a female porter, part of the auxiliaries, and she's carrying 8 82mm mortar rounds. And you can see how they use a porting stick and they cut the end of it so that it's like a fork. They insert 4 rounds and they tie it shut. And they do the same thing on the back to give you a balanced load. So this is an interesting way that you can carry mortar rounds, recoilless rifle rounds, and other heavy material in SHTF. This is an excellent photograph of the stick log bridge for the troop trail, and it's probably the best quality one I've seen of this photograph. You see this photograph in a huge amount of books and online, and here you can actually see the detail of how it's constructed with the bamboo. And what I'll do is refer you to the Boy Scout field book, and you can look at the square lash, the diagonal lash, and that's what's used to build this. So you can actually build this with rope. So this is a way they negotiated a several 100-foot cliff. So the way they negotiated this ridge and drop is they just built a combination set of stairs and ladders right into the side of it, using lashings and bamboo. Keep this in mind. Now, these photographs kind of show everyday life on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And here we have truck drivers and a commander. And you can see the condition of the truck and how much dirt's on it. So these were all maintained to the point of failure. Here we have an engineering and auxiliary unit working together to repair a bomb-damaged road. And then here we have a photograph which shows the aftermath of a B-52 strike. And you can see here that on the right-hand side, it's very hard to see, but that is a dead Vietnamese soldier or porter. And I believe that's a Ho Chi Minh bicycle with crates. But it's very hard to tell from this. This was taken soon after a bomb strike. So the interesting thing about this book is it has a lot of day-to-day discussions. And also some of these people lived through the war. Some of them died during the war. And the author knew a lot of these people and also saw them after the war. So there's a lot of stories about people and what they went through that would be interesting for you to read. So the auxiliaries were used to boost the morale of the men quite a bit. And this is a column of porters, mostly female, that you can see moving through the jungle. And they would have anywhere from 40 to 80 kilograms in these sacks. Now, this is a very interesting photo, and the caption doesn't really tell you what you're looking at. In here, what I suspect is right here near the exit from the river, there was probably a bomb strike where you had a massive crater. So if a 1,000-pound or a 2,000-pound bomb hit right where the trucks are driving beside, that would have created a massive break in this underwater stone bridge. So it looks to me like they made a repair so the trucks are driving upstream, and then they turn here on the left to access the exit, because it looks like from the pattern of the water there that there's a massive bomb crater that actually took out part of the bridge. And then here we have another one of the vertical ladder stair assemblies, and you can see how it's constructed, and it's spaced quite a bit. It's actually spaced quite far apart for my taste, but it seemed to be manageable to save materials and rope, and that's how they would actually climb and move over these ravines. And we have another photograph, and this is page 34, and what we're doing is looking at road repair following a bomb strike. Now on page 35, what we're doing is looking at a communication soldier. This is a lineman that's stringing telephone wire, and communications was critical because trucks would not go all the way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They would go part way between stations, unload, reload on new trucks. So the station chief was in charge of maintaining the trucks and the road for that area. And communications was critical because traffic was one way on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So if you were traveling south, you did that on a certain number of days, and then the vehicles would turn and return a day or two later going north. So you always had to coordinate this. So if communications weren't available, you had to have road guides to do that. And that's something we need to look at in SHTF, because when you repair road nets or you make alternate paths, you're going to have to control the traffic on these and which direction it's flowing, because to save labor, you're probably going to just be making a one-way road. And bridges are critical. It's so much easier to build a one-lane bridge than a two-lane bridge. So you may have to have two people or a flag system where you are flagging the side of the bridge that's open. So you'd have a red flag on one side and a green flag on the other side of the bridge showing which side can enter and which has to stop. Now on page 36, we have a picture of an elephant moving supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And an interesting thing in reading this book and other books, I found that the North Vietnamese and the tribesmen in Laos and Cambodia use elephants extensively to move stuff up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They found that the elephants could handle the slopes and the rivers that vehicles couldn't handle and people couldn't handle. The other thing is they found elephants were very easy to blend and hide in the jungle. Now, this is the only photograph I've seen of them using horses on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But there's mention that in certain areas where horses were prevalent, they would be used on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But this is the only photo I've ever seen of that. Now we're going to look at some photos from Station 41 on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is a photograph of one of the truck drivers, and a lot of these vehicles, the windshields were gone on them. So that was either attrition or deliberate, but I think it's attrition and battle damage because of the amount of rain. Now, the main operation of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was during the dry season, which I think was about 5 to 6 months of the year. This is one of the more modern ZIL trucks. What's interesting is it has the frame here for camouflage, but there's no camouflage applied to it. Then we have another ZIL 6-wheel drive truck behind it. Now, you can get a good look at the frame here. So they would have two bamboo poles on the bumper, and they would be cocked away from the truck, and then you'd have a frame above the cab. And what this did is allowed the entire truck to be covered. Now, the photographs we're looking at are the road being put in operation right after a carpet bombing. So you can see the destruction here in the bomb crater right beside the road. And this photograph is interesting because it's post-bomb strike, and you can see the amount of vegetative debris and wood that's down on the ground. So the consideration of crossing this, cleaning it up, and the tires of the vehicles is something that's very rarely discussed. So in SHTF, you need heavy off-road tires in order to be able to drive over a lot of this debris. Now, what's interesting is this book in particular mentions the fact that B-52 strikes were extremely effective in stopping mobility. And the reason was the heavier bombs that you could carry on a B-52, they would actually uproot the root ball of the trees. So after a B-52 strike, you would have a lot more debris. You would have bomb craters, but the blast would also create craters from trees being uprooted 100, 200 yards away from where the bomb fell. So using the 2,000-pound heavy bombs to create root exposure on down trees contributed to jamming up the Ho Chi Minh Trail for extended periods of time. Now, this is an interesting photograph on page 44, and you can see the actual communist combat cameramen here, not the ones that pose on YouTube. And they're taking a picture of these Vietnamese female porters. They're using a Ho Chi Minh bicycle, and this to me looks like an 82 millimeter recoilless rifle because the mount in the center there does not appear to be a mortar tube mount, and it looks a little thin for a mortar barrel. Now on this side we have a volunteer group, and you know, that's kind of a euphemism in a communist country. So these were entertainment people, song and dance, morale, and we have a truck and a soldier. And unfortunately for them, a lot of them were killed shortly after the photo. Now, this photo is very interesting. This is a tour by one of the generals in the North Vietnamese Army. But when we're looking at these helmets of the North Vietnamese soldiers, they look like East German helmets. So they were either East German supplied or they were copied and manufactured in North Vietnam on the East German pattern. But it's interesting that people don't realize that Vietnam received aid from almost all Warsaw Pact countries, not just China and Russia. So on page 48, here we have a grain porter that's moving rice and other grain. So she has a Ho Chi Minh bicycle, and she has multiple sacks of grain. So she's probably carrying about 250, 300 pounds of grain here. Now on page 49, I really like this page because it shows several things. Now this looks to me like an earlier camouflage version because they haven't built the wood frame over the front of the truck. And this one to me looks like it's also an earlier war version because what we have here is a 75 millimeter recoilless rifle. Now, in the Chinese Civil War, we supplied a lot of weapons to nationalist China to fight the communists, and they also manufactured copies of those weapons. So the U.S. 57 millimeter recoilless rifle and 75 millimeter recoilless rifles were copied extensively by the Chinese, and the communist Chinese used these extensively in Vietnam. And here you can see the barrel of one being carried on a Ho Chi Minh bicycle along with grain. And in front of it, the female is pushing the mount for the 75 millimeter recoilless rifle and several bags of grain. But what we find is the Chinese copied a lot of technology, both US and Russian, and they fed that into Vietnam later. Now, page 58 is very interesting because it shows two things. And we'll start with the top photograph. This chapter of the book is talking a lot about defending the Ho Chi Minh Trail and attacking bases that were put up around it by the Americans and Vietnamese to block the supply flow. And here you can see a log bunker complex. So we're looking at this photo, and what we see in the background is a log fortification. So it's hard to tell if this is trench work or the side of a bunker, but there's very little information available on Vietnamese bunker construction and field fortification, whether it's Vietcong or NVA. I've looked extensively and there's almost nothing. So that's an area for future study. So if anybody has any information on a source for that, that would be appreciated in the comments. Now, this bottom photograph is showing a attack. Now, this looks like a staged photograph to me, but the important thing is we're looking at an RPG-2 in the foreground. And when it comes to obsolete weapons, that's a relative term, because during the war here in the North Vietnamese Army in Warsaw Pact, the RPG-2 was being phased out, and RPG-7, which we see so much of today, was being phased in. And the Chinese had a domestic produced version of this. I can't remember if it was called the B-40 or the B-41. But most of the ones in Vietnam were actually Chinese manufactured RPG-2s. Now, what you find is the RPG-2, even though its performance is so low compared to an RPG-7, is the fact that it is completely effective on armored personnel carriers, trucks, bunkers, things like that. So the Vietcong and NVA used them extensively against everything except tanks. And when you look at the 57 recoilless and the 75 millimeter recoilless, the same situation with that, they could take on anything except a main battle tank. So they would use salvos of RPG-2, 7, and recoilless rifle rounds against the M48 tanks. Now on page 60, this is one of their heroes that was a platoon leader. And you can see him here. He's had his wounds bandaged and he's posing with a Tokarev pistol. And this book talks a lot about the combatants and what they experienced. And, you know, they have their heroes that they're putting up also, just like we do. This photograph is actually a troop train where the troops and their porters are moving down a road. And you can see the individual camouflage on the troops and porters. And this guy doesn't have any camo on him. The one in front has just a little bit, looks like a bush rag on the top of his pack. But here you can see one side of the porting pole that's cut for mortar rounds. So you can kind of see the mortar rounds there he's carrying. Now, the interesting thing here is the other aircraft that seemed to do the most damage to the Ho Chi Minh Trail was the AC-130 gunship. So the AC-130s with the 20 millimeter cannons would tear trucks up. And I've read studies from RAND and Air Force where they looked at how many hits that it would take to take a truck out. With a 20 millimeter cannon, one hit to the engine would take the truck out. And then they also had the semi-automatic 105s. And when you upgraded to the 40 millimeter Bofors guns on the AC-130, then you could get marginal hits on the truck and destroy it. So we can see the Vietnamese really tell us that the AC-130 gunships And the B-52 with 2,000-pound bombs were probably the most effective in disrupting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So here on page 62, we have another hero of the Vietnamese Army, North Vietnamese Army on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And it refers to an article published, I believe, an article published probably in France and in Vietnam, where it discusses his 52 combat decorations. So here you have a highly skilled and highly decorated North Vietnamese soldier. And then here, as part of the propaganda effort, one of the bases that was put near the Ho Chi Minh Trail to disrupt it was overrun and destroyed. So you have a South Vietnamese Marine here that was shot through both legs that was captured. And in this book, I noticed there's a lot of discussion of good treatment of soldiers that were captured by the NVA, and that does not fit with the history of the people I talked to that actually fought in the war. So here we have another highly respected guerrilla leader, and I would say from the dress and everything, she was probably Vietcong rather than NVA. And most interesting, you know, you see a lot of photographs from cameras captured by the enemy. All of these, except the right-hand photograph, were photos from a camera captured when Americans abandoned a location in Vietnam and was developed by the author. So a lot of these are by an unknown photographer. And then I'd kind of like to wrap up talking about these, because here we have them talking extensively about supporting America for the Vietnamese war effort against America. And they talk a lot about Vietnam veterans against the war. And this is an anti-war unit in the field. And then we had different protests. And what I kind of like to say about this is my wife's brother, in his graduating class, was one of the last ones that had to draft to Vietnam. And he was not drafted, but a lot of his friends were. And they went to Vietnam and fought. Some of them didn't come back. Some of them come back messed up. And it's interesting, when they had their high school reunion, none of the feelings had gone away. So you had one group of people on one side of the auditorium and one group on the other. And that was divided by the ones that went to Canada and the ones that went to Vietnam and the protesters. So there was no reconciliation between the two sides after that war, because in the 2000s at the high school reunion, the two sides are still hating each other. And here we have another propaganda photograph where the North Vietnamese soldier on the left is giving water to a South Vietnamese soldier on the right. And in conversations with Rangers and Special Forces in Vietnam, was that they told me that anytime a Special Forces unit was captured, all of the indigenous were executed on the spot by the Viet Cong for the most part, and in the U.S., people was taken prisoner and tortured. So this is really a questionable photograph taken for propaganda purposes. So it would be interesting to see the perspective of both sides on how prisoners were treated, because what was related to me is not what I see in most publications that were made in Vietnam after the war. So the rest of the book would be really good to read, because it talks about the entertainment of the soldiers, what they did in their time off, how long they fought, what their rotations were, and a lot about casualty data. But it's based on an individual area. I believe it was Station 41. So a lot of this has photographs of people and interviews of ones that survived the war. So both of these books would be great for you to get. They may be very hard to obtain, but they provide a lot of day-to-day information on what going through this would be like. And you can notice the bunker in the background. You can kind of barely see the opening behind the RPD light machine gun that's behind the dude's head. So when you're looking here, the guy that's eating, there's a entrance to the bunker, and then your RPD light machine gun behind the dude on the left there. So please share your thoughts, just a few ramblings and thoughts on Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we'll see you on the next video.